Hey Joe, how are you, man? How you doing?
Hey, good, man. I woke up this morning.
You woke
Phew.
up this morning. That's great, man. That's great. I'm all right. We're coming on now. We're live. Hey Joe, it's a privilege to have you on the show, man. Uh, I really appreciate. Joe and I have a little history. As juvenile delinquents, I spent a little bit of time at Spofford Correctional Facility where Joe was a counselor. And I grew up listening to his music. Actually, my brothers first turned me on because I was hearing them singing to your songs when it came on the radio, right? So, what I didn't know was that many years later, while I was in prison, I began singing your songs. And listen, your music inspired me and inspired others. And, we're talking about guys with broken hearts in the correctional system when they heard your songs. You know how that feels, right?
Oh, of course.
Uh,
Yeah.
we sang to Poor Boy, Ordinary, Sad Girl, My Cloud. Those were some of the favorites of these inmates that I hung with. Decades later, when I wrote my book, I knew I had to meet you. And although, it actually went through a mutual friend. I don't know if you remember who that was. Uh, but we met at a restaurant in Spanish Harlem. You remember
That's
that?
right. Yeah, I remember.
Yeah, and we talked, we exchanged autographs, and then we did a little video together before the party. But
That's
the next
right.
time that I saw you was at your concert in Miami when you invited me backstage. You remember that?
Right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, well, listen, Joe, you're an idol to many, man. We know you lived a fascinating life, bro. Really intriguing to me and to so many others. And we're talking a little bit about that. First, let the
Okay.
audience know how you're doing. Tell me how you're doing, really. How are you, Joe?
Well, I'm doing fine. Look, I'm 82 years old. God bless me. I've been had my ups and downs, but you know what? I learned that whatever Waterloos or things that I was going through, that was part of the suffering for my enjoyment at the end, for salvation. So I learned to turn my negativity into joy. And that's the secret because everything else that I've done all my life is vanity, right? It doesn't mean anything. Uh, Spiritual, that's where my mood is and that's where my direction is headed.
Come back. Say that again. Don't mess with
Yeah.
none of those
Did
buttons,
you hear
Joe.
me?
I hear you.
Okay. Yes. I
Okay,
said that.
so
Basically what it is that I'm spiritual now. Everything else that I've done in my life is vanity and it's really not important in the sense as far as my journey goes. It's good for history and for people that have aspirations to do something with their life. My story is a motivator, right? But nevertheless, at the end of the road, we can't take our belongings with us. It's all going to stay right here. So it's time to get spiritual.
I hear you.
So, Joe, it's a pleasure to meet you. I mean, I've been a fan of yours my entire life. My whole entire upbringing at home in Brooklyn, New York, was basically my parents just blasting your music. So, first, I didn't know what it was because it was so interesting to me because it was a mixture of R&B, Latin, mambo, salsa, and then it was in English too. And I was like, "What? What is this?" I couldn't even explain what it was. So, you want to elaborate on that? I know you there. They call
Yeah.
you the king of Latin soul. You got so many names, and you deserve them all. But you
Yes.
can explain some of that to us?
Well, growing up, I grew up with Anglo radio. There was nothing else on the radio. You didn't hear Latin music or black music. Everything was in the middle dial was Anglo music. We heard Patti Page, Frank Sinatra, Tony Bennett, and et cetera, et cetera. And it was only until later on, in the late 50s or the early 60s, that there were black stations at the end of the dial and there were Latin stations at the other end of the dial. So that's where the signal wasn't as strong as the Anglo stations. But nevertheless, I got privy to this and we started to listen. radio was the focal point of communication for us because we didn't have iPhones and all the technology that they had now. All we had was our labia and what we heard, and we imitated that. And I was no different. What I heard on the radio influenced me. And of course, my first upbringing was with Anglo radio, and then it was influenced by R&B, rock and roll, and then Latin. Latin came in last, and then of course jazz and everything else followed. But that mixture allowed me to develop my own style, which is Latin soul. Although I came in the Boogaloo era, uh, I think it was Ray Barretto who did Watusi, Joe Cuba did Bang Bang, Hector Rivera did At the Party. And I said, wow, I said, that's right down my line. I could do that. And then I found out the secret was that in a lot of cha-cha beats, I could sing those songs that were done in Spanish and English, right? And it's so funny because I tell everybody, and it's in my book, uh, which I just published my memoir, Streetology, that Smokey Robinson was doing this years ago and he didn't even know. He
Mm.
did songs by Mary Wells, and those were cha-cha beats sung in English. And when I got a hold of that, I developed the style. And the one thing that separated me from other Latin soul artists is with my lyrics. I was a lyricist, and I decided to tell a story. And the stories that I knew well were my upbringing from the streets of New York and El Barrio, and how I grew up, the struggles, the heartaches. And I put that into music, and it endeared me to my public.
Yeah, don't move too much, Joe. Keep it steady, brother. We just lost you. Go ahead. Speak.
Okay, you didn't hear it?
Yeah,
We heard you freeze for a second,
you,
just a
you
second.
froze a second there, but it's all good. Uh,
So, so Joe, it's really interesting that you said that the Latin music was the last thing that you were into because
Right.
I always thought you were Latin. I thought you was a Latino my entire life. I just found out today. So, but you're not. So, can you tell the people listening where you're from?
Well, you know what? I probably was more Latino than Latinos because I knew the history. I had to learn the language in the streets. Um, all my friends were Boricua, and I grew up that way. I never put any how do you stamp on nationality back then. I didn't grow up that way because I grew up with Jews, Japanese, Filipino, but the predominantly blacks and mostly Puerto Ricans. So we hung out together, we spoke together, and the predominantly language was English. The Spanish that I had to learn was slang. It was New Yorican, and
yes.
I learned that, and then I had to learn the culture. So before I even could speak Spanish, I was into R&B and all those other different genres of music. And then finally, when I discovered Puente and Tito Rodriguez and Eddie Palmieri on the jukebox, then I became involved after I came out of prison because I stopped some of the guys on the street and I said, hey, let's go sing some doo-wop today. They said, Joe, we don't do that no more. So what do you mean? He said, I got a band. A band? What the hell is that? He says, well, come to the rehearsal and hear us. I was amazed. I went into Johnny Colon rehearsal and this new music, it mystified me. I said, this clave, which I didn't know anything about clave back then. And I had two left feet. I couldn't even dance mambo. So by the rudiments and what happened was a strange story. I think the guy got upset that I came to his rehearsal because I was known as the títere from the block, and they didn't really want me there. And I was appalled at that because, at any other time, I would have probably punched him in his face. And what do you mean you don't want me? This is my neighborhood. And nevertheless, I left there angry, and I said, look, uh, I don't want anything from your music. I just love music. I wanted to hear your music. But if that's the way you feel, the hell with you. I'll leave. And right then I decided I'm going to show this guy was a schoolmate of mine. I decided I was going to start a band and I was going to show this guy that I could do the same thing he was doing. And I had no tools, no knowledge of music. I couldn't play the piano. All I had was an ear and a gift of gab. And I went and found a piano in a community center and I discovered the keys on that piano and I taught myself how to play in 6 months. And then I started a band, and the rest is history. So if you look back at it, it's almost like a Cinderella story. Somebody had their hand on top of me, and it was my aggression, I guess the Scorpio in me, that wouldn't let me lay down, that I knew I was destined to do something, because my first ambition was to be an athlete. But when that didn't work out, thank God for music, because it allowed me to have a home life.
So let's go back. Let's go back a little bit to the beginning. Okay. So you're not Latino. You are African American and Filipino, right?
Right. What happened was that everybody took it for granted that I was Latino, because I spoke the language. I even looked Latino, and I had Latino girlfriends, but it was in 1973 that I looked in the mirror. And at that time, there was a lot of nationalism going on in the country, average white man, I'm black and I'm proud, and all these different genres. And I said, what the hell am I? I looked in the mirror and I said, I really don't have no damn identity. You know,
Mhm.
I said, I can't say I'm this and I can't say I'm that because I'm not. But yet, I felt I was Latino, because I knew everything that Latinos did. I probably even knew more than the average Latino that walked in the street that didn't even know who Aviso Campos was. But nevertheless, I looked in the mirror and I said, who the hell am I? And I coined the term Afro Filipino.
So you were born
And
in Spanish Harlem.
I was born in Spanish Harlem. My father's Filipino from Manila, and my mother's African American from Newport News, Virginia. But el
Hmm.
corazón mío Latino.
Yeah. So let's talk about that Spanish Harlem, where you come from. Because back in the days, it was infamous, and I know there was a lot of hanging out, and it was drug infested. Give our viewers an insight of what Spanish Harlem was like back then.
Well, you had to survive. It was survival of the fittest. It was by any means necessary. Uh, we didn't have money to go to college. We didn't have aspirations to be wealthy. We had to hustle. We had to know where the next dollar was coming from. So to dream about the next dollar, we went out and shined shoes on the corner, whatever we made from lifting packages and carrying to people's houses. That was our income for goodies, to go to the candy store, to buy anything. And of course, as we got older, we thought of different ways uh, to enrich our pockets. And of course, a lot of that got us into trouble. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
We did everything. Of course, drugs infiltrated the neighborhood later on, and that was a bad omen for a lot of people. I was lucky to escape that because I didn't enjoy it. I didn't like it. And that was probably the difference. Um, Having gone through that and that little history, it was a tough time to grow up, but yet it was a great time because everybody knew everybody. The streets were filled with music. You could hear music when you walk down the streets from the fire escapes. The radios would be blasting your favorite songs. And there was a mixture. There was R&B coming out of one window, and there was Ran Can Can by Puente out of another window. And of course, there probably was Patty Page in another one. But nevertheless, it was this conglomeration of music that influenced me. And it was a way of life. Everybody saved 78 records back then, you know,
A lot of
and we
energy.
had collections,
A lot of
and
energy in the streets back then, huh?
I'm sorry?
A lot of energy.
Yeah, well, yeah, no, it was a hard time to grow up, but nevertheless, it was the only way to grow up because we had to make a dollar. And our dreams were far-fetched because there were only two ways that a kid in el barrio could succeed. He either became a boss or he rose up in music. And I was fortunate to take that path in music.
So tell me, I understand that at 15 you were a gang leader, the Dragons, which was a popular gang in Spanish Harlem back then. So is it
Yeah,
fair to
very
say
notorious gang.
that
Of course, a lot of the gangs happened in the Spanish Harlem throughout the years. There were story tales of rival gangs between the Dragons and the Viceroys, the Enchanters. I mean, all the way to Red Hook and Brooklyn, you named it. The Mama Chaplains. They had the Red Wings, Italian gangs. They were conglomerations of gangs in New York, and that was the fad at that time. If you didn't belong to a gang, you didn't hang out. You didn't have no hangout card. And of course, I was no different. Even though I did some boxing as a youngster, my father had taught me with a punching bag he put up in the vacant apartment. But nevertheless, uh, I joined the gang because that was the thing. The girls were all around, and it was the easy way to show your manhood back at that time. Nevertheless, it got a lot of us into trouble, and I was no different.
But you were actually the gang leader of the Dragons, were you?
I'm sorry?
Were you the leader, the founder of the Dragons, or?
No, I wasn't the founder, but as the gang went on in time, I succeeded a lot of different people, and I ended up running the gang at a later stage. But it was
Right.
so funny because when I took the gang over, there was only two of us left.
Guy back then?
Look, but what's your description of a tough guy? And for me to describe that now, I was foolish. Um, I didn't take any shit
Yeah.
from nobody. If you want to put it that way. Um, I'm not proud of. Uh, when I think about it in retrospect, I just asked for a lot of things that I was involved with at that time, but it was a part of growing up. It was a learning experience for me to teach other kids what I went through. And I became a counselor at the same place that I was locked up in Spofford. And I was able to mentor kids that went through the same problems that I did. And I was very effective because I
Um,
never had to raise my hand at a kid, you know.
yeah. So when you said in your life was very Machiavellian,
Well,
Machiavelli.
at that time, yeah, well, we by any means necessary, we didn't care. At least I didn't. Uh, how I had to reach my goal, anything in my way, you would push aside, you know. So it was by any means necessary, and that's exactly what it means. Now, I still use that theory, but always in a positive way. Now, back then, it was very negative.
Yeah. And at 18, you did time in Coxsackie Correctional Facility,
Yeah,
where,
yeah,
quite frankly,
yeah.
in my 12 years doing time, was one of the only prisons I never visit. What was that like, being in prison? Were you depressed? Were you wild? Were you singing to the inmates back then?
Well, when the judge sentenced me away, I didn't think I was going to go away. I had got busted three different times for robbery, stolen car, etc. And my mother used to wash floors, and she got a lawyer, and she spent all this money, and he didn't get me off. He told me he was going to get me off, but he said, "Never mind, son, just plead guilty to this felony, and we'll see if we get you probation." Well, I pleaded guilty to grand larceny in the second degree, but I had no idea that that was a term of 5 years. And the
Mm.
judge sentenced me. And, the next thing I knew, I was being led in handcuffs into the bullpen. And I said, "What's going on?" He says, "Well, you got sentenced." I said, "What? How long?" He said, "A zip five." I said, "What the hell does that mean?" He said, "Anytime from
Okay.
now
So you
to
thought you were gonna
five
do a few
years."
months or a few weeks,
Huh?
probably. Wow. You thought you were just gonna do a few weeks, probably.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So I said, "Oh, I'll be out in a couple of weeks." I was still laying there waiting for the parole board. It wasn't until 2 years later uh, that I was released. But when I got there, uh, the prison was no different than the streets. There were gangs in the prison. There were segregation lines separating the whites, the blacks, the Puerto Ricans, and the creeps uh, in in uh, in the yard. And I was appalled by that because I didn't grow up that way. But nevertheless, I stood in Spain. And some of the guys there say, "Well, Jay, he's not even Puerto Rican." He said, "Yeah, but he's from the neighborhood. He comes in here." And I was determined to walk through there where anybody that said anything going to go to blows. And that was my take on it. I had no problem. I fit right in. Nobody bothered me. I had to fight my way out there several times, but thank God that I had some training in boxing back then. Um, Nevertheless, I handled myself. And of course, you're the depressing there, waiting for packages from home, no letters, and you got to eat the same food 3 times a day. You got to go up on a count every day, uh, being told what to do. You're being addressed by a number. I mean, after a while, it gets to you. But I was determined to make believe that I was in college. And that's what
Yes.
I did. I read everything that I could get my hands on. I graduated. I was in there taking Regents exams. Uh, my coach had got me a scholarship to Howard University to run track. And I was looking forward to that to come home. When I was paroled, they said, "Well, gee, how come you did so well here and you didn't do well when you were in the streets?" He said, "You must be jail wise." I said, "No, no, I just learned my lesson." Nevertheless, I didn't learn my lesson. In 9 months, I was back there again, a
Oh
violation,
wow.
you know. So I ended up maxing out another 9 months. And then I came home determined to do something with my
Mm.
life.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So
I'm
Joe,
sorry?
thank you for telling us how you managed to survive the game and the street life of Spanish Harlem. By any chance, were there any popular individuals that you hung out with in the hood, or that you maybe even met in prison?
Oh, well, I don't know what you call popular to us. They were guys that were notorious in the neighborhood. Uh, I know where I was. Rocky Graciano was there, but that was many years before I was there. And so was Mike Tyson. Uh, he was there, but he was there before me. You know.
What about like when you started your career in music? Who were the guys that were coming up that you was hanging out with that have a name today?
Yes,
Well,
and
there was.
also, Joe, I'm sorry for a second, but I also read somewhere that there was a lot of guys hating on you, man. A lot of guys hating on you back then. They didn't like you for some reason. I don't know if they were scared of you or they didn't understand your style. Or can you
It
explain
was a
that?
combination. I think, first of all, uh, I guess they were jealous of my ways, you know, that I thought that I was a tough guy and they couldn't approach me. And maybe that was why they didn't like me for one reason. Maybe they thought that I was arrogant or I didn't fit into their mode of ways of doing things. And I had all the girls. For some reason, I had the prettiest girls in East Harlem, and they couldn't understand that. You know, being that I wasn't Latino, and I guess half of them didn't know that. Uh, but nevertheless, it was all a combination of those things and how we grew up back then. And of course, I hung out with a crowd that was much older than myself, and maybe that's why a lot of people didn't take to me because people my own age didn't fit in my journey. I was too far advanced in the hustle for them to even congregate with me. I don't know how to explain that, but growing up, you have a certain way of who you hang with, and people my own age couldn't hang with me. So most of my friends were at least 3 or 4 years older than me. Even my girlfriends, they were all older than me. You know, so that could be a reason why.
Absolutely. And I mean, we can see that. We can see even in your music, you were way ahead of your time back then, way ahead of your time. And we can see your mentality, although you did get in trouble because that's the way of life back then, but we see how you overcame that. And when do you think it was time for you to move on? Like you said, wait a second, I had enough of this. I had enough of this life that I'm living right now, getting in trouble, being in the streets.
Or before that question, just let us know, like a two-part question. what was the hardest thing that you had to struggle with that you overcame? And then part two to Felix's question.
Well, after the Cinderella story, me becoming Joe Batan, uh, I didn't handle it properly. I thought it would never end. And I never put anything away. I never saved anything. I just thought whatever I had, I could spend and I could do it again the next day. Well, it doesn't work like that in life. You have to be prepared. Uh, you have to dodge the things that you do so that you have an abundance to survive. But because of the way I grew up and the way things came to me so quickly, uh, I was very foolish, like a lot of entertainers are when they don't know the business or they just uh, wet behind the ears and they don't know about life itself and how to survive. I had to learn from the streets on how to survive, and after a while, it really hit me. Years later, uh, I had a dispute with Fania Records,
Are
and
you there?
I wasn't getting paid my residuals, and I stormed out. I challenged
Yo, come
them,
back.
and I was the
Come
first
back.
artist to challenge
You
the
did.
record
Come
companies.
back.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, Joe, I'm sure you can hear us.
Yes. Can you hear me?
We still see you, but we cannot hear you. I'm not sure if you can still hear us.
I hear you. You
You
want me to
there?
do? Yeah, I'm here. Hello.
The video, but we lost your audio for a second, Joe. I'm not really sure if you can hear us.
I can hear you.
No,
Hello.
don't hear you, Joe.
I don't know what happened. Wait a minute. Where's my glasses? Uh, it's got here. That's muted. Now it's on. Hello.
Come back, Joe.
Yeah.
Yeah, we lost your audio, Joe. For some reason, we lost your audio. We cannot hear you.
Wow.
A technician to go out to your place and fix it.
Let
So
me see.
Hit a button by mistake. We're not really sure.
Hello. No.
anyway, folks, maybe we'll pick this up some other time. We do a part two of this session. We don't want to keep going. What do you think?
Yeah, I think
So,
we had some difficulty. I think I tried to cover it. Joe, if you still can hear us, we're not sure. We really
Yes.
honored, super honored to finally meet you, and I'm sure Hector has a lot of words for you to say about you as well.
yeah, for sure, Joe. We wanted to get into your music career and talk a little bit about that. Being the pioneer of the Boogaloo, and uh, we wanted to talk a lot about that and some of the big names that you hung with in the industry. So there were a couple of questions, and I wanted to talk to you about Rafi Pagana. I knew that you had mentioned him earlier, and your music's are pretty similar. You also talked about Smokey Robinson and Frankie Lyman, and we wanted to get into some of that because that was some really interesting stuff, including the acting that you've done,
Yes.
and like that. City of God's Son, where you work with Nas. I think that's a rapper, and you talked about Jay-Z and a few other guys. So we just wanted to put that out there. I know Joe can probably hear on his subject to this. We wanted to just give you that little background history because Joe lost his audience, and we just wanted to get into what was next for Joe. Okay, Joe, I know you've come full circle. We wanted to know what your life was like today. We know that you got into your spirit. And I just had a big question when you sang the prayer. And I want
Oh,
to really know if that was your
yes.
beginning of your journey with God. So I'm going to close this segment because Joe has not come back. I'm so pleased to have gotten to know you, Joe. Whether you know it or not, you have had an impact on my life, life of many others. Your music has gone with my heart forever. Thank you for coming on the show today, Joe. We love you, and I'll talk to you on the phone, and we could recap that way.
Everyone that tuned in, we appreciate you being here. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we lost his audio for some reason. He lost his audio on his end, but we appreciate you all. Thank you so much.
Yeah, on our end, everything been resolved. But Joe, I still see you.
Okay.
I'll call you so that we can continue talking.
Okay.
Much.
All right. All right.
Peace. Let's talk on the phone.
Thank you, everybody, and we will see you next week.
Yes, yeah, we appreciate your time and coming on and dealing with us, or actually hanging on despite all the difficulties we first had, and we had to reschedule our
It wasn't
calendar.
easy.
So yeah, it wasn't easy. It was taskful. The programming was an issue, a lot of glitches, but we're back, and we're glad that we had been able to get through the show uh, with just this little glitch on Joe's end. Thank you guys. See you again next
See
week.
you next week.